That night, in front of hundreds of the world's most powerful crime bosses, her husband pointed directly at her and laughed, calling her useless, calling their marriage the biggest mistake of his life. The whole room burst into laughter, and she just smiled. A smile that even the most skilled assassins in the room wouldn't dare look at. Because none of them knew. The woman standing silently that night held the fate of all of them in her hands. Like and comment the city you're viewing to let me know how far this story has come. Now, let's begin. The chandelier above the Blackthorn Grand's main ballroom had 800 crystal drops, each one catching the light and throwing it back in fractured pieces across the faces of men who had ordered executions over dinner. Eliana had counted them once, 3 years ago, on a night when she needed something, anything, to look at besides her husband's profile as he shook hands with a weapons trafficker from Marseille. 800 pieces of glass pretending to be something more. She thought about that now, standing at the edge of the ballroom in a dress the color of ash, a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, warming in her fingers. Around her, the American Syndicate Council's annual gathering churned at full force. 100 conversations happening simultaneously in 6 languages, men in Italian wool and women draped in borrowed diamonds, the whole room smelling of expensive cologne and the specific kind of tension that lived underneath every gathering where everyone present had reasons to want everyone else dead. Vincenzo was across the room. She didn't have to look to know exactly where he stood. After 10 years of marriage, his location in any room was something she registered the way other people registered weather, automatically, without choosing to. He was laughing. That broad, open laugh he used when performing for an audience, the one that never reached the back of his eyes. 3 men stood around him. Sal Benedetti, who ran the Eastern Seaboard narcotics corridors, Frank Cutter, whose legitimate shipping business moved about 15% of the syndicate's product through Port Newark, and Dmitry Ashov, who was technically a Russian diplomatic attaché and practically the most dangerous money launderer operating out of the Eastern Bloc. All 3 were laughing with Vincenzo, laughing at the right volume, at the right moments. Eliana watched the performance and felt nothing except a low, steady tiredness. A woman appeared beside her, Greta Benedetti, Sal's wife, draped in something gold that cost more than most people made in a year. She leaned close enough that Eliana could smell her perfume, something sharp and floral that didn't quite cover the cigarettes underneath. "You look like you're counting exits," Greta said. "Old habit," Eliana said. Greta laughed, which meant she thought it was a joke. Vincenzo had started moving through the crowd now, working the room the way he always worked rooms. An arm around a shoulder here, a murmured confidence there, the careful architecture of a man reminding everyone present that they needed him more than he needed them. He was good at it, genuinely gifted at the particular theater of dominance that kept an organization like his from collapsing under the weight of everyone's competing ambitions. She had admired it once. She had admired a lot of things once. He caught her eye across the room. For a moment, just a moment, something passed across his face, an expression she couldn't quite name anymore. Then someone touched his arm, and he turned away, and the moment dissolved. Greta drifted off toward the bar. Eliana stayed where she was. The speeches began at 9. Romano Vitelli, the council's chairman, a 72-year-old man who had survived 4 assassination attempts and 2 federal investigations and seemed likely to outlast everyone in the room through sheer stubbornness, took the podium and worked through the annual ritual. Acknowledgements, alliances reaffirmed, the performance of unity that everyone present understood was exactly that, a performance, while the real negotiations happened in side rooms and encrypted messages and the careful geography of who sat next to whom at dinner. Eliana listened without listening. She knew every beat of this by now. Then Vincenzo took the podium. She saw it coming in the way his shoulders shifted when Romano yielded the microphone, that particular set of posture that meant he had decided to make something of a moment. She'd learned to read him in granular detail over 10 years, knew the difference between the version of him that was simply confident and the version that was performing confidence for an audience that he wanted to impress. Knew which laugh meant he was genuinely amused, and which meant he was establishing something. This was the establishing kind. "Gentlemen," he said, and the room quieted the way rooms quiet around Vincenzo Moretti, not gradually, but almost instantly, the conversations cutting off in a ripple that moved from his immediate circle outward until the only sound was the faint string music from the quartet in the far corner. "And ladies," he added, and a few people smiled at the acknowledgement. "Another year, another gathering, another reminder that what we've built together is worth more than any single empire any one of us might imagine we could build alone." Applause, the appropriate kind, calibrated by men who understood that enthusiasm had to be measured. Vincenzo smiled, paused. Let the room settle back into attention. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to acknowledge something personal." Eliana's fingers tightened fractionally around her champagne glass. 10 years ago, I made a decision that some of you questioned." He gestured in her direction without looking directly at her, a gesture she understood immediately, because it was the kind of gesture that establishes something as a prop before using it. "I married a woman with no family, no connections, no name worth speaking in these circles." A beat. "Some of you were diplomatic about your concerns. Others were not." Light laughter from the room. Looking back, and here his voice shifted into something that was performing regret while actually delivering a verdict. "I understand why. A man in my position needs a partner who contributes, who brings something to the table beyond—" He gestured again, vaguely this time. "Presence." The laughter this time was different, fuller. The crowd understood what he was doing, using his wife as a vehicle for a kind of self-deprecating humor that was actually neither self-deprecating nor humorous, but was a public declaration, a reclassification. He had done this before, in smaller rooms, in passing comments, in the way he introduced her at events. "My wife," said with a flattening of tone that communicated exactly how much weight those two words were meant to carry. But this was the largest room, the most important audience, and he was choosing to say it here, clearly, in front of everyone who mattered. 10 years, he said, and I can't point to a single thing she's brought into this organization. Not one alliance, not one asset, nothing. The laughter came again, louder. Men who had built their reputations on being feared, laughing at a woman standing 20 feet away in a dress the color of ash, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. Eliana looked at her husband. He was looking at the room now, working the applause, his timing perfect. He'd probably planned this. Or maybe it had just occurred to him, the way certain cruelties occur to people when they feel sufficiently certain of their own position, effortlessly, the way water runs downhill. She thought about the 800 crystal drops in the chandelier overhead. She thought about Prague in winter, the way the Vltava looked from the upper windows of the estate on the hill, gray and wide and completely indifferent to everything happening on its banks. She thought about her father's hands, how large they had seemed when she was small, how careful. She smiled. Not the smile she used for Greta Benedetti and the other wives. Not the diplomatic smile she'd developed over years of standing beside Vincenzo at events like this. A different kind of smile, quieter, with something underneath it that she would not have been able to name and would not have tried to. She set the champagne glass down on the nearest surface and walked out of the ballroom. No one tried to stop her. She didn't expect them to. She was, after all, a woman with no family, no connections, no name worth speaking. She crossed the lobby of the Blackthorn Grand without hurrying, nodded at the doorman who held the door, and stepped out into the Chicago night. It was February. The cold came off the lake with genuine malice, the kind of cold that didn't just hit you, but got inside your coat, inside your skin, got all the way down to the place where your actual thoughts lived. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. Her phone was in her clutch. She opened it and sent one message to a contact listed only as M, tonight. Then she put the phone away and waited for the car she had arranged 3 weeks ago, which was not the car Vincenzo's people had arranged, and which would take her not to the apartment on Lakeshore Drive, where she had spent the last 10 years being invisible, but to a private airfield 40 minutes outside the city. She did not go back inside to retrieve her coat. The flight to Prague was 9 hours. She slept for 6 of them, which was something she hadn't been able to do regularly in years. Sleep deeply, without listening for sounds in the apartment, without the low vigilance that had become such a constant presence in her body that she'd almost stopped noticing it. But the moment the wheels left the ground, something in her chest unclenched, not gradually. All at once, like a fist opening. She woke up over the Atlantic and ate the meal that had been prepared and sat with a glass of water watching the darkness outside the window, and thought very carefully about nothing at all. Marek met her at the airfield. He was a large man, somewhere in his 50s, with a face that had been rearranged by decades of violence into something that looked less like a face and more like a geological formation. He had worked for her father for 30 years, and for her for the past decade without anyone in Chicago knowing he existed. He opened the car door without speaking. He didn't need to speak. He had understood, from the single message, exactly what was happening and what it required of him. The drive into the city took 40 minutes. Prague in February was iron gray and beautiful, the bridges over the Vltava wearing thin crusts of frost, the old city rising on the hill with the stubborn confidence of something that had survived every catastrophe thrown at it across 800 years. Eliana watched it through the window and felt the particular sensation she always felt coming back here. Not quite homecoming, because she had worked very hard to make Chicago her home, but something adjacent to it. A recognition that went deeper than memory. The estate was on the eastern edge of the old city, concealed behind 3 layers of security that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A private residence on paper, acquired through a holding company registered in Luxembourg, which was owned by a trust established in Liechtenstein, which traced eventually, through enough layers to make the tracing meaningless, to a name that had not appeared on any official document in 11 years. Her name. Eliana Volkov. Not Eliana Vale. Not Mrs. Moretti. Eliana Volkov, the only child of Viktor Volkov, who had built the Continental Shadow Alliance from 12 men in a shipping operation in 1987 into the largest criminal coalition in European history before his death 4 years ago, and who had left every piece of it, every account, every alliance, every obligation and loyalty and carefully constructed relationship to his daughter. She had not taken it immediately. She had needed time. She had still, in those early days of grief, believed in the life she had built in Chicago. She had thought, with the specific foolishness of someone who wants very badly to believe something, that Vincenzo might be a reason to stay separate from all of this. She understood now what that belief had cost her. Not in power, not in money, in time. 10 years of time of being smiled at and looked past and eventually, tonight, laughed at in a room full of people who should have been afraid to breathe too loudly in her presence. Marek opened the estate's front door and she walked inside. The house was warm. The staff, small, loyal, all of them here for years, moved through the space with the particular quietness of people who understood that their employer had returned under specific circumstances that did not call for noise. In the study on the second floor, her father's desk still occupied the center of the room, which was intentional. She sat down behind it and opened the laptop that Marek placed in front of her and began to work. It took her 40 minutes to make 11 calls, not phone calls, encrypted communications through channels that the NSA and Europol and every intelligence service on the continent had spent years trying to identify and had not, because the people who built them had understood that the only truly secure communication was one that didn't look like communication at all. She sent messages, she received confirmations. She authorized the beginning of a sequence of actions that had been prepared and held in reserve for exactly this contingency, for the moment when she decided that the fiction of her Chicago life had served its purpose and needed to end. She closed the laptop at 4 a.m. Marek was still in the room. He had been standing by the window the whole time, watching the dark city outside. Not because there was anything to watch, but because that was what Marek did. He maintained vigilance the way other people maintain breathing, automatically, without ever being asked. "The first signals will reach New York by morning," she said. "Yes, the banking channels first, then the shipping contracts. Everything is in place." She nodded. Outside, Prague was very still. The Vltava moved somewhere beyond the buildings, indifferent and constant. "He'll think it's a rival family," she said. Not a question. "At first," Marek said, "it won't take him long to understand it's something else." "No," she agreed. "It won't." She thought about Vincenzo standing at that podium, laughing with the room, his voice doing the thing it did when he was completely certain of his own position. Thought about 10 years of dinners and events, and the careful performance of being a particular kind of wife, present, silent, contributing nothing, as he'd said. As he'd said, in front of everyone. She thought about the first time she'd met him, how certain she had been, how profoundly, entirely certain, in the way you could only be when you were 26 and hadn't yet learned the specific weight of a decade. Get some sleep, Mark said. Tomorrow will be complicated. Tomorrow will be the beginning, she said. The complicated part comes after. She left the study and walked upstairs to the room that had been prepared and sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness and did not sleep. She sat and looked at the window and thought about everything she had held in place for 10 years through the simple force of deciding to hold it. Every instinct suppressed, every capability concealed, every connection maintained in secret while she played the role of the woman who had nothing. She thought about what it meant to stop holding it. The thought should have frightened her. She examined it carefully, the way she examined everything, looking for the fear. It wasn't there. What was there instead was something quieter and steadier and much, much older. It felt like the moment before a storm front arrives, when the air pressure drops and everything goes still and the birds stop making noise because they understand, at whatever level birds understand anything, that what is coming will be significant. Not dangerous necessarily, simply significant. By the time Vincenzo Moretti woke up in the apartment on Lakeshore Drive and found the closet empty and no note, and his wife's phone going straight to voicemail, the first threads had already begun to pull. He just didn't know it yet. He wouldn't know it until the calls started. Until Sal Benedetti reached him at noon with a voice stripped of its usual careful confidence, saying that 3 of their holding accounts in Switzerland had been frozen overnight. Until Frank Cutter called 40 minutes later to say that a shipment out of Rotterdam had simply disappeared, not intercepted, not seized, just gone, as though it had never existed. Until Dmitry Ashov stopped returning calls entirely. By then, the thread would be a rope. By then, Vincenzo Moretti would be pulling on it in the dark, and the more he pulled, the more the darkness around him would become clear. And what he would find at the center of it, staring back at him from the other end, would be a face he should have looked at more carefully 10 years ago, on a winter night in a room where 800 crystal drops caught the light and threw it back in fractured pieces, and the woman beside him counted them quietly and waited and said nothing at all. Vincenzo found the note at 7:43 in the morning, except there was no note. That was the thing that took him longest to process, and not the empty closet, not the absence of her phone on the charger, not even the untouched side of the bed, which was cold in a way that told him she hadn't slept in it at all. What stopped him in the doorway of the walk-in closet for a full 30 seconds, his coffee going cold in his hand, was the absence of any explanation, any message, any acknowledgement that she had been there at all. Eliana didn't do anything without precision. He knew that much about her, whatever else he'd failed to understand. She didn't misplace things. She didn't forget. Every action she took was considered in a way that had sometimes irritated him because it made impulsiveness feel like a character flaw by comparison. So the absence of a note was itself a message. He just didn't speak the language yet. He called her cell twice. Voicemail both times, the automated kind, which meant either the phone was off or she'd removed the SIM. He stood in the kitchen of the Lakeshore Drive apartment and drank the rest of his cold coffee and told himself this was nothing, a reaction. She was hurt, and she'd gone to a hotel, and by tomorrow there would be a conversation that he would manage the way he managed most conversations with her. Efficiently, with the minimum acknowledgement necessary to return things to equilibrium. He had told himself variations of this before. He was still telling himself this version at noon when Sal Benedetti called. Sal didn't sound like himself. That was the first thing Vincenzo registered, before the words made sense. The specific texture of Sal's voice was wrong. Sal had been operating in environments that would destroy most people for 30 years, and the result was a voice that had been stripped of every frequency that could be read as uncertainty. When Sal was concerned, he sounded analytical. When Sal was afraid, he sounded careful. What he sounded like now, Vincenzo didn't immediately have a word for. 3 accounts, Sal said. Zurich, Geneva, and the Cayman routing, all frozen as of 3 this morning. Vincenzo put his coffee cup down. Frozen how? Frozen like someone filed the right paperwork with the right people, and those people moved on it before anyone on our side knew it was happening. Not a seizure. There's no federal flag, no Interpol marker. The banks just stopped. Like a switch got thrown. That's not how banking works. I know how banking works, Sal said, and there was an edge in it now, something that would have been anger if Sal allowed himself anger. I'm telling you what happened. Someone with deep access to the compliance infrastructure told those banks to freeze those accounts. And those banks did it. And right now I have 3 conversations happening in parallel with 3 sets of lawyers. And none of them can tell me when this gets resolved, because none of them can figure out where the instruction originated. Vincenzo stood at his kitchen window and looked out at Lake Michigan, which was gray and choppy and completely uninterested in his problems. "Who did this?" he said. "That's what I'm saying. We don't know." "Guess." A pause. Now, Sal's pauses were never accidental. "It's not any domestic family. The compliance network these accounts are routed through. You'd have to know it from the inside to move on it this fast, this clean. This is someone with European infrastructure, old European infrastructure. The Marchetti people? Marchetti doesn't have this kind of reach, and Marchetti is 3 weeks from a federal indictment anyway. His people are busy not talking to prosecutors." Another pause. "Vincenzo, I need to know if there's something you haven't told me, something recent." The question landed with specific weight, because Sal Benedetti had been his consigliere for 11 years, and in 11 years Sal had never asked him that question directly, which meant Sal was asking it now because Sal had already run every other hypothesis and come back to something he didn't want to say out loud. "There's nothing," Vincenzo said. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that meant Sal didn't entirely believe him, but was choosing, for the moment, to proceed as if he did. Frank Cutter called at 12:40. The Rotterdam shipment was 42 containers moving through a legitimate freight corridor that Frank had spent 8 years building and protecting. It was insulated from exactly this kind of disruption through 6 layers of ownership and 3 separate customs relationships that had been maintained at considerable cost. The shipment didn't just get seized or rerouted, it vanished. Paperwork, manifests, the vessel's position transponder, the port records, all of it gone, replaced by documentation showing the containers had never existed. "You need to understand what I'm telling you," Frank said. He was standing somewhere noisy. Vincenzo could hear background sounds, the kind of ambient noise that suggested Frank was not in his office, which meant Frank was not where he was supposed to be, which meant Frank was worried enough about his office to avoid it. This isn't theft. Theft leaves traces. Someone with authority over that documentation chain reached in and scrubbed it. That takes not just access, that takes the kind of authority that doesn't get bought. It gets inherited. Inherited. I'm saying this is old money, old networks. The kind of thing where the person giving the order doesn't have to explain themselves because every person receiving the order already understands the hierarchy. Vincenzo went to his office and closed the door. He sat behind the desk where he had run his organization for 15 years and tried to think with the same clarity that had kept him alive and ahead for all of that time, and found, for the first time he could remember, that the clarity wasn't coming. What was coming instead was something he hadn't felt since he was very young. A specific physical unease, not fear. He was not a man who had easy access to fear, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the chest rather than the mind. He called Dmitry Ashov. The line rang 11 times and went to a generic voicemail. He called the secondary number, which Dmitry only gave to 4 people in the world, and which had never once gone unanswered. It rang 8 times and went to the same generic voicemail. He put his phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment, and then he picked it up again and called Marco Ruiz, who ran his New York operations, and asked him a single question. Marco took 17 seconds to answer. "The Benedetto family pulled their joint shipping contract this morning," Marco said. "Cited restructuring. I've been trying to reach you. The Castellan group in Philadelphia did the same thing 2 hours later. And Vincenzo..." A brief pause, the kind where someone is deciding how to say something. "I got a call from a contact in the Bratislava organization. They said they received a message this morning. From someone above them. The message told them to suspend all business with Moretti operations until further notice." "Who sent it?" The contact wouldn't say. He said, these are his words, he said the message came from a level he doesn't have access to. A level none of us have access to. He sounded... Marco stopped. Say it. He sounded scared. And this is a man who has never sounded scared in the 20 years I've known him. Vincenzo ended the call. He sat in his office for 6 minutes. He knew it was 6 minutes because he watched the clock on his desk the way he sometimes watched clocks when he needed to anchor himself to something concrete. The movement of the second hand, its complete indifference to everything. 60 seconds per rotation. No negotiation. Then he got up and walked to the kitchen and called his head of security, a man named Torres who had been with him for 8 years and who had the specific quality Vincenzo valued most in the people closest to him, the ability to deliver bad information without softening it. I need you to find my wife, Vincenzo said. Torres didn't respond immediately, which meant Torres was organizing what he already knew into the order in which to say it. She wasn't at the hotel, Torres said. I sent someone to the Waldorf in the Four Seasons as a first pass. She didn't check in anywhere in Chicago last night under her name or the 2 aliases we have on file for her. She has other aliases. Yes, Torres said. She does. Vincenzo's jaw tightened. He said nothing. The airport footage, Torres continued, from O'Hare. She passed through the private terminal at 11:58. The tail number on the aircraft she boarded, we ran it. The registration traces to a holding company in Luxembourg. We are currently trying to unwind the ownership chain, but the initial layers they're not what I expected. What did you expect? Something one of our rivals set up. Something American, or maybe Russian. Something with a recognizable architecture. A pause. This is not that. The holding structure is old. The oldest layer we've found so far has a registration date of 2003. Whatever this is, it was built before she met you. The kitchen was very quiet. Where did the plane go? Vincenzo said. Prague, Torres said. It landed at a private facility outside Prague at 8:22 this morning, local time. Vincenzo stood in his kitchen for a long moment. Outside, the lake was still gray, still choppy. A pleasure boat moved across his field of vision, small and determined, heading somewhere into that indifference. Keep pulling the thread, he said. There's something else, Torres said. Vincenzo waited. I made some calls to people who track certain kinds of legacy networks, European organized infrastructure, the kind that doesn't generate a lot of visible documentation, the kind that operates through relationships rather than structures. Torres sounded, for the first time in 8 years of working together, careful in a way that was not his default register. One of my contacts mentioned a name. I want to be clear that I'm not confirming this. I'm repeating what was said to me by someone who may be wrong. Say it. Volkov, Torres said. Viktor Volkov's organization, the Continental Shadow Alliance. A beat. My contact said the signals he's seen, the banking actions, the withdrawal of alliances, the documentation erasure in Rotterdam, these are consistent with how that organization operates. But Viktor Volkov has been dead for 4 years. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. He had a daughter, Torres said quietly. No one in our networks has ever met her. She kept herself out of the documentation entirely after Volkov died. But my contact said, he said she exists, and she inherited everything, and she has been operating at a level so far above what we interact with that most people in our world don't even know she's there. Vincenzo said nothing. Vincenzo. Torres's voice was very even. Her name was Eliana Volkov, before she changed it. The pleasure boat on the lake had moved beyond his line of sight. The water kept moving, indifferent and gray, the way water always moved, regardless of what was happening on the shore. Get me Sal, Vincenzo said finally. Get me Frank. Get me Marco in New York, my office. 3 hours. And Torres, he stopped. Yes. If anyone asks where I am, Vincenzo said slowly, you don't know. He ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, and then he did something he almost never did. He pressed the heels of his hands against the edge of the counter and let the physical pressure of it ground him, the cold granite against his palms, and he breathed, once, twice, the kind of deliberate breathing that had to be chosen rather than simply happening. He thought about the ballroom last night, the 800 chandeliers, the way the room had laughed. He thought about the smile she'd given him before she left. That specific, quiet smile. The one with something underneath it he hadn't been able to name. He thought about her eyes in the second before she turned and walked out of the ballroom. Not hurt, not angry, not devastated the way he'd half expected, half wanted, the way a wound proves the blade found something real. Her eyes had been completely clear. That was the thing that was living in his chest now, the thing that had displaced everything else. Not fear of what she was capable of, not yet. Not even the full comprehension of what he'd apparently spent 10 years being married to without knowing it. Just those eyes. The absolute absence of surprise in them. As if everything that was now happening had been, for a long time, a matter of... The meeting in his office lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, and by the end of it, the room smelled like sweat and coffee, and the particular kind of tension that accumulates when four men who have spent their lives projecting certainty are forced to sit in the same space and acknowledge that none of them have any. Sal had brought a folder. Sal always brought a folder, because Sal was the kind of man who needed his information in a physical form he could touch and arrange, and when necessary, put face down on the table so he didn't have to look at it. The folder was face down on the table within the first 15 minutes. Frank Cutter had arrived looking like he hadn't slept, which was accurate. He'd driven from Newark without telling his own security detail where he was going, which told Vincenzo more about Frank's current state of mind than anything Frank actually said. Marco Ruiz had dialed in on an encrypted line from New York because Marco had been advised by his own people not to travel, which was the first time in 15 years Marco had listened to that advice. Torres stood by the door. He always stood by the door. Vincenzo laid out what he knew. He did it in the flat, sequential way he delivered information when he needed people to receive it without the emotional coloring that would cause them to argue with the facts before they'd finished hearing them. He told them about the Luxembourg holding company, the Prague airfield. The name Torres had surfaced. He told them who Eliana was. The silence that followed was the longest silence he'd ever heard in that office. Sal picked up his folder, put it back down. "You didn't know," Sal said. It wasn't a question. It was worse than a question. It was an assessment. "No," Vincenzo said. "For 10 years. Yes." Frank was looking at the surface of the table. "The Shadow Alliance," he said quietly, like he was testing whether the words were real. Viktor Volkov's organization. "His daughter's organization now," Torres said from the door. Frank looked up. Something moved across his face, not quite fear, something more complicated. If that's what this is, if she actually has that infrastructure behind her, then what happened yesterday isn't the collapse. Yesterday was the announcement. The actual collapse hasn't started yet. "I know," Vincenzo said. "Do you?" Frank said. And there was an edge in it that was new, that Vincenzo noted and filed without reacting to. Because I want to be very clear about what I mean. Viktor Volkov's organization wasn't just large, it was foundational. Half the banking architecture the American syndicate runs its money through, the actual underlying structure, was built by people who worked for Volkov. If his heir decides she wants to be unpleasant, she doesn't have to do anything dramatic. She just has to make a few calls, and the plumbing we all depend on stops working. All of it, not just yours. The room absorbed this. "Then we find a way to talk to her," Vincenzo said. "You had 10 years to talk to her," Sal said. He said it without inflection, which was more damning than any anger would have been. Vincenzo looked at him. Sal held the look without flinching. This was new too. In 11 years of working together, Sal had never held a look like that. Had always, at the critical moment, deferred to the gravity of Vincenzo's position. The fact that he wasn't deferring now told Vincenzo exactly how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath everything. "I'll go to Prague," Vincenzo said. "She might not see you," Marco's voice said from the encrypted line. "She'll see me." He said it with more certainty than he felt. He said it because he needed to believe it, because the alternative that she had already made every decision and considered him irrelevant to all of them was not something he was prepared to process yet in a room with 3 other people watching his face. The meeting broke up without resolution, which was itself a kind of resolution. The understanding that there was nothing to be decided until Prague, that everything was suspended in a state of controlled deterioration that would continue until either he reached her or it didn't matter anymore because there was nothing left to reach her about. Torres walked the others out. When he came back, Vincenzo was standing at the window. "There's something I didn't say in the meeting," Torres said. Vincenzo didn't turn around. "Say it now." "The name my contacts surfaced. When I pushed for more context, more history, something about how Volkov's daughter ended up in Chicago, ended up in your orbit specifically." He pushed back on the question. He said it wasn't a random meeting. He said, Torres paused in the way that meant he was deciding how much to let the discomfort show. He said there's a theory, within certain European circles, that her being here wasn't about you at all, that her being here was about being somewhere she wasn't, being invisible inside a marriage that made her disappear completely from any network that might have been looking for her. Vincenzo turned from the window. He said there were people looking for her after Victor died, rivals, people who wanted to contest the inheritance before she could consolidate it. And the fastest way to become unfindable, Torres met his eyes steadily, was to become someone's unremarkable wife. The room was very quiet. "He doesn't know this for certain," Torres said. "It's a theory." "Yes," Vincenzo said. His voice came out completely even, which required more effort than anything he'd done in years. "It is." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and put it on, and he looked at Torres and he said, "Book Prague. Tonight. Go." He landed in a different world. He'd been to Prague before, twice, for meetings. The kind of Eastern European operational contacts that formed the outer edge of the syndicate's reach. He'd moved through the city quickly, transactionally, the way he moved through most places outside Chicago. He'd noticed the bridges, the way the old city sat on its hill. He hadn't looked at it long enough for it to mean anything. Now, coming down from the private terminal in the flat gray light of a Czech February morning, the city looked different. Not physically different, but the way that spaces look different when you understand that someone you know moves through them as though they belong to her. The car Torres had arranged took him into the old city. He had an address, the best Torres could get from 2 days of careful inquiry, a property that surfaced after the third layer of the Luxembourg structure was peeled back, and which was listed as a private cultural foundation with offices in a building on a street he couldn't pronounce. He was halfway there when the car stopped, not gradually. It stopped the way cars stop when someone in front of them has stopped first, abruptly, with a small lurch. His driver said something in Czech that Vincenzo didn't understand, and then 2 black vehicles pulled alongside them, one on each side, matching their stopped position exactly. The back door opened. A man got in. Large, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts, and the specific stillness of someone who had spent decades in environments where moving unnecessarily was something you learned not to do. "Mr. Moretti," the man said. His English was accented but precise. "You're going to tell me she knows I'm here," Vincenzo said. "She has known since you booked the flight." The man looked at him without hostility and without warmth, just assessment. The way you'd look at a structural problem you'd been asked to evaluate. "She asked me to bring you to her. She could have just given me the address." "She could have," the man agreed, and said nothing else. They drove for 20 minutes, deeper into the city and then up, the streets narrowing as they climbed until the car turned through a gate that Vincenzo would not have noticed if he hadn't been looking for it, and into a courtyard, and stopped. The estate was not what he'd imagined. He'd imagined fortress, something that announced its own impregnability. What he found was a building that simply looked private, in the way that the most serious kinds of money looked private. Not ostentatious, not hidden, but possessing a quality of settled permanence that said it had been here longer than most of the concerns currently occupying everyone's attention, and expected to be here long after. The large man walked him inside and up a staircase, and stopped at a door on the second floor and knocked once. "Come in," Eliana said. The man opened the door and stepped aside. Vincenzo walked in. She was behind a desk. Not performing behind a desk the way people performed when they wanted to establish authority. Not staged, not arranged for effect. She was working. There were papers and an open laptop and a cup of something hot that was half finished, and she looked up from what she was doing with the specific expression of someone who has allocated a defined amount of time for a meeting and intends to use it efficiently. She looked rested. That was the first thing that hit him, more than the desk, more than the room, more than the large man closing the door behind him. She looked like she had slept soundly for the first time in years, which maybe she had, and the thought of that settled somewhere in his chest with a weight he didn't know how to categorize. "Sit down," she said. He sat. The room was warm. Outside the window, Prague's rooftops ran toward the horizon under a sky the color of old iron, and somewhere below the Vltava moved through its banks in complete indifference to the conversation happening above it. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the 10 years of their marriage sat between them in the room the way the fact of any long duration sits, not as a single thing, but as an accumulated weight of specific moments, specific choices, specific ordinary hours that had meant something or hadn't. "I would have done something differently," he said, "if I had known." "I know you would have," she said. "That's why I didn't tell you." He absorbed this. "You didn't tell me because you wanted to know who I was without it." "Yes." "And now you know." "Yes, she said. "I do." He leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me what this is. Is this punishment? Is this you burning everything because of one night?" Her expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted. A fractional recalibration, the kind that meant he'd said something that struck her as simultaneously understandable and deeply wrong. "It's not punishment, Vincenzo. Punishment implies I'm trying to make you feel something. I'm not trying to make you feel anything." She closed the laptop. "I'm simply stopping." "Stopping what?" "Pretending." The word landed flat and final, with the specific weight of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being permitted to exist in the open air. He opened his mouth, then he closed it. Because the argument he'd been building during the flight, the version of this conversation where he controlled the narrative and found the lever that would return things to a manageable state, all of it assumed a version of her that wasn't in this room. The version in this room was someone he was meeting, in some essential way, for the first time. "The alliance withdrawals," he said. "The banking. You can reverse that." "I can," she agreed. "Will you?" She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you offering?" "Whatever you need." Something moved across her face. Not contempt. Something that might have been sadness, or might have been the memory of sadness, which is a different thing. "That's the wrong question, Vincenzo. You're still trying to solve this the way you solve everything. Find the leverage, name the price, close the transaction." She shook her head, one slow movement. "That's not what this is." "Then tell me what it is." "It's an ending," she said. "A clean one, if you'll allow it." He stood up. He didn't mean to. It happened the way physical reactions happen when the body doesn't wait for the mind's authorization. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking at the rooftops and the iron sky, and said nothing for a long moment because he didn't trust what would come out if he opened his mouth. "I was wrong," he said finally. "Last night. Everything I said." "Yes. I am saying I was wrong." "I heard you." He turned around. "Then what does that get me?" "Accuracy," she said. "That's all." He looked at her across the room, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he felt the full weight of it. Not just the empire fracturing, not just the alliances withdrawing, but the specific, irreducible fact of this woman sitting behind her father's desk in this room in this city, completely at ease with herself in a way she had never been permitted to be in the apartment on Lakeshore Drive, and understanding that the ease was not new, that it had always been there, underneath the performance of being nobody, and that he had lived beside it for 10 years without ever being curious enough to look. He was about to speak when Marek opened the door without knocking. In 8 hours of knowing the man, Vincenzo had already calibrated him as someone who did not act without cause. So when Marek walked in without knocking, Vincenzo turned immediately, and the expression on Marek's face, not fear, but the highest grade alertness, the kind that precedes violence the way barometric pressure precedes weather, stopped every other thought. Marek spoke in Czech, low and fast. Eliana's eyes went very still as she listened. She asked one question, a single sentence. Marek answered it. She stood up. "What?" Vincenzo said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read at all. It seems we have a more immediate problem than our marriage. What happened? 3 of my people in Vienna were hit an hour ago. 2 are dead. Her voice was completely level, the way voices go level when the person speaking has learned to process shock as information rather than experience. The team I sent to secure the Rotterdam documentation. Gone. No contact. Vincenzo went still. This isn't me. Whatever you're thinking, I know it isn't you, she said. She said it without hesitation, which landed differently than he expected. You don't have the network for this kind of parallel action. This is someone else. Who? She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something he recognized from his own experience. The specific expression of someone who has just understood something they should have seen coming. Someone who has made a calculation about a person in their orbit and now has to live with the fact that the calculation was wrong. Benedetti, she said quietly. Vincenzo went cold. Sal. His name surfaced in the Vienna intercepts 2 minutes ago. Marek placed a phone on the desk. On the screen was a message, encrypted and then decrypted, the kind of communication that took infrastructure to produce. Vincenzo looked at it without touching it. The message was from a routing address in Philadelphia. The recipient was listed as the Bratislava organization. The content was an authorization code followed by 3 words. Take them both. He knew, Vincenzo said. The word came out flattened, stripped of everything that wasn't fact. He already knew about you. Before I told him yesterday, He's known for longer than you have, Eliana said. That's what I'm trying to understand, how long he's been positioned on the other side of this. He's been my consigliere for 11 years. Yes, she said. She looked at Vincenzo with an expression that was not satisfaction, because there was nothing satisfying about any of this, but was the particular quality of someone who has had a theory confirmed in the worst possible way. 11 years is a long time to wait for the right moment. Marek said something else in Czech. Eliana responded and then looked at Vincenzo, and the calculation in her eyes was fast and visible and entirely unsentimental. This building has 4 known entry points and 2 that aren't known, she said. They will find the 4 within the hour, which means we have approximately 40 minutes before this location is no longer viable. Where do we go? She looked at him. That depends entirely on whether you are going to be useful or whether you are going to be a complication. He held her look without flinching. He thought about 11 years of Sal Benedetti standing 3 feet to his left. 11 years of folder and calculated silences and perfectly calibrated advice. 11 years of building someone else's path to everything Vincenzo had spent his life constructing, and the whole time the architect of that path had been standing in his office, drinking his coffee, and telling him exactly what he needed to hear in order to stay manageable. Tell me what you need, Vincenzo said. It was the same sentence he'd used 20 minutes ago, standing across from her trying to negotiate a transaction. But it came out differently this time, stripped of the negotiating register, stripped of the management reflex. It came out raw, which was not a thing he was accustomed to sounding, and the unfamiliarity of it in his own mouth told him more about how thoroughly everything had changed in the last 48 hours than anything else that had happened since the night he stood at a podium and performed the role of a man who had everything figured out. Eliana looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she said, Stay close to Marek. Don't make decisions without telling me first. And don't lie to me about anything, starting now. Agreed, he said. She was already moving. They left through a door that wasn't on any architectural record of the building, a passage behind a panel in the study that opened into a narrow service corridor, which ran to a sublevel that connected to the building next door, which had a separate street exit onto a lane that appeared on satellite imagery as a maintenance access for a neighboring property. Eliana moved through it without hesitation, without a flashlight, navigating by memory in the near dark with the specific confidence of someone who had walked this route enough times that her body knew it independently of her mind. Vincenzo followed. He kept his mouth shut, and he kept up, and he paid attention, because those were the 3 things the situation required, and he was smart enough to know it. Marek was behind them both. He had a phone in one hand and something that was not a phone in the other hand. And he was receiving updates in his earpiece and relaying them in low check, and the information in his face, though Vincenzo couldn't understand the words, was legible enough. Things were moving faster than anticipated. They came out of the service lane into a side street where two vehicles were already waiting, engines running. A woman Vincenzo didn't recognize was behind the wheel of the first one, young, with the compact coiled quality of someone whose stillness was a form of readiness. She looked at Eliana when they came through the door and said 3 words in Czech. Eliana said 1 word back and got into the vehicle. Vincenzo got in after her. Marek took the second car. "How many people do you have in this city?" Vincenzo said, as the woman pulled into traffic with the smooth assurance of someone who had driven in far worse circumstances. "Enough," Eliana said. She was looking at her phone, her thumb moving across the screen with decisive speed. "The Vienna team. I need to know if it was just the 2 or if there are others unaccounted for." "You're thinking about your people right now." "My people are dead," she said, without looking up. "Thinking about them is the only thing I can do for them at the moment." He said nothing. The city moved past the windows to the old streets, the frost on the ironwork, the particular gray daylight of Central Europe in February that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Vincenzo watched it and tried to build a picture of what Sal had actually done, the full architecture of it, because understanding the structure of the problem was the only thing that had ever reliably kept him alive when everything else was moving too fast. Sal had known about Eliana's identity. The question was when, before the marriage or discovered during it. If before, then the introduction, the courtship, all of it had been managed from a position of knowledge that Vincenzo had never had, which meant Sal had spent 11 years sitting inside Vincenzo's operation with a card in his hand that he'd been waiting to play. If he'd discovered it in the years of the marriage and sat on it, the calculation was even longer, even colder, and the end it was designed to reach was the same. A moment when both Eliana's emergence and Vincenzo's collapse could be triggered simultaneously, creating a vacuum that the Bratislava network and whatever coalition Sal had built could rush to fill. Either way, the patience involved was extraordinary, the kind of patience that required not just discipline, but genuine belief in the destination. "He's been planning to take both organizations," Vincenzo said. Eliana looked up from her phone. "Not just mine, yours." He worked through it aloud because working through it aloud was faster than working through it silently, and speed mattered. He needed your emergence. He needed the moment when the Volkov assets were visibly in motion, when the transition from hidden heir to active principal was actually happening, because that's the moment of maximum vulnerability. Everything shifting, nothing yet settled. He couldn't move before because your network was dormant and invisible. He had to wait until you activated it. She was watching him work through it. Her expression was neutral, but her attention was not. He could feel the quality of her attention, the way you feel temperature, something measurable against the skin. "The humiliation at the event," he said. "Did he?" "I don't know yet," she said. "It's possible he suggested it, or allowed certain conversations to happen that made it more likely." A pause. "It's also possible you needed no help arriving at it on your own." He accepted that. "Yes." Either way, the effect was the same. I activated. He was ready. The car made a turn and slowed, and the driver said something low and rapid. Eliana leaned forward to look through the windshield. Vincenzo looked too. The street ahead was blocked, not by traffic, by the deliberate arrangement of 2 vehicles parked across both lanes, and the specific quality of stillness around them that meant the people who'd parked them were close, but not visible. "Back," Eliana said. The driver was already reversing, her movements precise and without any wasted motion. The car going backwards down the street at a speed that was efficient without becoming theatrical. A second vehicle appeared behind them, filling the rear view. 2 points, Vincenzo said. "At least." Eliana had her phone to her ear, speaking Czech in short, sharp sentences. Then she lowered it and looked at their driver. The driver said something. Eliana said 1 word. The car turned hard left into a space that barely looked like a lane. A gap between buildings, cobblestone, the mirrors on both sides missing the brick by centimeters, and accelerated through it and came out onto a wider street and kept moving. "Where are we going?" Vincenzo said. Somewhere they haven't mapped yet. She was looking at her phone again. I have a property on the eastern edge. Off documentation. No holding company, registered to a private individual who doesn't exist. How long until Marek? He knows where to meet us. Vincenzo looked at her. The car was moving through Prague's back geography now, the parts that didn't make it onto tourist maps, narrow and layered and full of the particular character of a city that has absorbed 8 centuries of people deciding they needed to disappear. He thought briefly about how at home she looked in it, how thoroughly, completely at home. You loved Prague, he said. Not a question. She glanced at him. Yes? You never told me. You never asked where I'd been happy, she said. You asked where I'd been. That's different. The second property was a flat on the top floor of a building that looked residential from the street and was, in every practical sense, a command center. Banks of monitors, encrypted communications equipment, a situation room that someone had built into what appeared from outside to be a converted apartment with the patient thoroughness of construction that takes years and is designed never to need explaining. Marek arrived 14 minutes after they did, with 2 of his people, all 3 of them moving with the focused efficiency of people operating inside a known emergency protocol. They spread a map on the central table, but not a digital map, a physical one, marked by hand with locations and notations in at least 3 languages. And for 20 minutes there was a rapid, layered conversation in Czech and English, and occasional Russian, which Vincenzo mostly followed and occasionally didn't, and which he listened to without interrupting because the discipline of not interrupting was the most useful thing he could contribute. He had one piece the room needed, and everyone in it knew it. Sal's operational people in Europe, he said, when Eliana looked at him. He has a man in Bratislava named Kovic, Czech national, runs logistics for the Eastern Bloc contacts. I have a private number that bypasses the organizational line. He used it when he needed things moved without Sal knowing the volume. He paused. I didn't think about what that meant at the time. I thought it was operational discretion. Now I think it was Sal building a parallel line he could activate independently. You have the number. Yes. Eliana looked at Marek. Something passed between them. If we can reach Kovic before Sal's people do, Kovic knows the full activation sequence for whatever Sal is running, Vincenzo said. He'd have to. He's the logistics architecture. If we can turn him, or if we can intercept him, he's already in motion, Marek said. He left Bratislava this morning. Our people tracked him to Vienna, then lost him. He's coming here, Eliana said. It wasn't a guess. He's coordinating the ground operation, Vincenzo said. If Sal is in Philadelphia and Kovic is the European operator, then Kovic is 60 to 90 minutes from this city, Eliana finished. The room went tight. Not louder, tighter. The kind of collective recalibration that happens in a space when the time horizon suddenly compresses. We need Kovic alive, she said. Agreed. And we need the activation codes he's carrying, or the operation doesn't just stop here. Sal triggers the secondary sequence remotely, and we lose the documentation chain that proves the Vienna hit originated with him, which means we lose the legal lever that collapses his syndicate position. Vincenzo looked at her. You're planning the legal end of this already. I've been planning the legal end of this since Vienna, she said. The violence is a problem to survive. The documentation is how it ends permanently. He had run his organization for 15 years with the operating principle that legal architecture was for other people's problems, that the real structure of power existed outside the law's reach, that the law was something you managed rather than used. He looked at this woman across a map table in a hidden room in Prague and understood, with the specific clarity that comes from being entirely out of your depth, that his operating principle had been a very local and very temporary form of intelligence. That someone who understood both systems simultaneously was playing a longer and more powerful game than he had ever attempted. Tell me what you need me to do, he said. Kovic knows your voice, Eliana said. He's never met Marek. He's never met any of my people. He has met you. You want me to bring him in? I want you to make contact and get him to a location of our choosing, she said, without him knowing who's waiting. If he's already in operational mode, he'll be suspicious of any contact from me. Yes, which is why the contact has to be something he can't refuse. She looked at him steadily. What does Kovic want more than anything Sal can offer him? Vincenzo thought about Kovic. The 3 times he'd met the man, the specific texture of his ambitions, the way he talked about Bratislava versus how he talked about the Western European networks, the hunger that lived underneath his professionalism. Out, Vincenzo said. He wants out of Bratislava. He's been the regional logistics coordinator for 11 years, and he's watched every man above him either get promoted to a Western position or get killed, and he is done waiting for his turn. Then offer him the turn. He won't believe a phone call. He'll believe a phone call from you, she said, because you're the one person Sal has never given him a reason to distrust. Whatever Sal told his people about you, he wouldn't have told Kovic to watch out for you specifically. You were the mark. Kovic would expect you to be in Chicago, panicking. Something moved across her face. You calling him from Prague in control, offering him a position in a Western network. That reads as an opportunity, not a trap. It was clean. He hated that it was clean. And when he's in the room, Vincenzo said. We get the codes, she said, and we get the chain of command. All of it, documented, in a format that the federal contacts I maintain in 4 countries can act on within hours. You have federal contacts. My father built relationships on every side of every line, she said. I inherited them all. He stood there for a moment with the full weight of it, the complete picture of what he had been married to for 10 years, and he felt something he couldn't immediately name, not envy, not anger, not even the wounded vanity he might have expected. Something quieter. The sensation of understanding, arriving late and arriving all at once, the way certain truths do when you've been refusing them long enough. He picked up the phone. Kovic answered on the 3rd ring. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Vincenzo kept his voice level and his pace deliberate, and he offered Kovic the one thing Kovic had been building toward for 11 years, a direct position in the Western distribution network, bypassing Sal entirely. The kind of operational independence that the Bratislava tier never got. He told Kovic he was in Prague, that things with the Moretti organization were in transition, that there was a window right now that would close in hours. Kovic's breathing changed on the line. Vincenzo heard it. The shift from professional neutrality to the specific texture of someone who is calculating very fast and arriving at the answer they want to arrive at. Where? Kovic said. Vincenzo gave him a location. Not this building. A location 4 blocks away, a restaurant that Marek had identified in the 20 minutes since they'd arrived, a space with 3 exits and a private room in the back, and sight lines that allowed for observation from outside before entry. Kovic said he'd be there in 90 minutes. Vincenzo put the phone down. He'll bring people, Marek said. 1, maybe 2. He's not going to show up to a private meeting with a full team. If this goes wrong for him, he doesn't want Sal knowing he took the call. Vincenzo looked at Eliana. He'll have a backup outside, but he'll come into the room alone or with one person. That's how he operates. Eliana looked at Marek. Marek nodded slightly. Then we have 80 minutes, she said. She began issuing instructions in Czech, and the room reconfigured itself around those instructions, the way a well-built machine reconfigures around a new input. Smoothly, without friction, everyone moving with the immediate purposefulness of people who have trained for exactly this kind of hour. Vincenzo stood at the edge of the activity and watched her. And what he was watching was not the Eliana he had constructed over 10 years of looking without seeing, not the quiet woman at the edge of the ballroom, not the decorative presence he'd performed his contempt of in front of 100 witnesses. What he was watching was someone operating at the absolute center of her own capability, in the environment she'd been built for, with the full resources of what she'd inherited and what she'd earned running through her like current through copper. He thought about the chandelier. 800 crystal drops, counted in the dark, while he shook hands with a weapons trafficker and called it building an empire. He went to get ready. The restaurant was called something in Czech he couldn't read, and it occupied the ground floor of a building that was at least 200 years old and smelled like wood smoke and old stone. At 3 in the afternoon, it was half empty. Vincenzo was at a table in the back room when Kovic came through the door at the 92-minute mark, which meant he'd taken 2 extra minutes to circle the block and verify the exterior, which was what Vincenzo had expected and had accounted for. Kovic was a compact man in his mid-40s, with close-cropped hair and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to look at rooms the way other people read text, for information, for threat, for exit. He came into the back room with one person behind him, a younger man who stayed by the door. "Mr. Moretti," Kovic said. "Sit down," Vincenzo said. Kovic sat. He was looking at Vincenzo with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. Whatever he'd expected, whatever he'd prepared for, Vincenzo, sitting calmly in a chair in Prague, was close enough to plausible that Kovic was allowing himself to proceed. "You reached out to me directly," Kovic said, "not through Sal." "No," Vincenzo said, "not through Sal." A beat. "Why?" "Because what I'm offering you is something Sal can't be part of." Kovic's eyes moved very slightly. A microscopic calculation. "What are you offering?" "The truth about what Sal has been doing," Vincenzo said, "and a way out of the middle of it before it collapses on everyone who didn't choose it." The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own kind of pressure. Then a door behind Kovic opened. Kovic turned in his chair, fast, one hand moving towards something under his jacket, and stopped. Eliana walked in. She was carrying nothing. She was wearing what she'd been wearing in the estate, understated, precise, nothing that announced itself. She walked to the table and sat down across from Kovic, and she looked at him, and the look was sufficient. Kovic's hand came away from his jacket slowly. His face had gone through 3 separate expressions in the 2 seconds since she'd walked in, and had settled on something that was trying very hard to be controlled and wasn't quite managing it. "You know who I am," she said. "Yes," Kovic said. "Then you understand the position you are currently in." Kovic looked at Vincenzo. Something in the look was almost accusatory, not at Vincenzo specifically, but at the situation, at the gap between what he'd thought this meeting was and what it actually was. "I didn't order Vienna," Kovic said. "No," Eliana said. "But you know who did. And you know what comes next, and you know that when it reaches Prague, where you currently are, the radius will not distinguish between people who gave the order and people who were simply in the proximity of those who did." Kovic's jaw tightened. His man at the door hadn't moved, but his weight had shifted. "I need the activation sequence," Eliana said, "and I need the documentation of Benedetti's instruction chain for the last 14 months. Everything. You know where it lives." "If I give you that," Kovic said, "I'm finished with every network in Eastern Europe." "Yes," she said. "You are." He looked at her. "What I'm offering instead," she said, "is the Western position Mr. Moretti described. Real, not contingent, not dependent on Benedetti's network surviving the next 72 hours, which it will not." She held his gaze. "You've been in Bratislava for 11 years, Mr. Kovic. You've done the work. You've built the infrastructure. And you have watched Sal Benedetti take the credit for it and give you nothing in return except enough rope to hang yourself with the moment his plan required a scapegoat." Something moved in Kovic's face, fast and then controlled, but it had been there. "You know I'm right," she said. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the restaurant beyond the door, a glass clinked against a table and someone laughed at something. An ordinary afternoon sound that had no business being this close to what was happening in this room. Kovic looked at the table. He looked at Vincenzo. He looked at Eliana. Then he reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, the gesture of a man communicating that what he was about to produce was documentation, not threat, and set a phone on the table. "The activation sequence is in a partition," he said, "encrypted. I'll give you the key." Eliana looked at Marek, who had been standing in the corner of the room in the way that Marek stood in corners of rooms, entirely still, entirely present, invisible until relevant. Marek came forward and took the phone. "The instruction chain," she said. "There's a server in Bratislava," Kovic said. He gave an address. He gave access credentials. He said them in the flat voice of someone crossing a line they've been standing on the edge of for long enough that the crossing, when it finally comes, is almost a... Marek took the credentials and the phone and walked out of the room without a word. The younger man at the door looked at Kovic. Kovic shook his head once, and the younger man's shoulders dropped a fraction. Not relaxing, just releasing the specific tension of someone who had been preparing to act and now wasn't. "What happens to me?" Kovic said. "You leave Prague tonight," Eliana said. "Where you go is your business. The Western position is real. It will be structured through a channel that has no connection to anything Benedetti can touch. It activates in 72 hours, after the documentation has been processed and the federal contacts have moved." She looked at him steadily. "But if you contact Benedetti between now and then, if you contact anyone in his network, if you deviate from what you just agreed to in any way..." "I understand," Kovic said. "I need you to say it." A beat. "I understand," he said again. Differently this time, with the weight of a man who has just changed the fundamental coordinates of his own life and is only beginning to understand what that means for everything downstream. Eliana stood. Vincenzo stood with her. They left Kovic at the table with his man at the door and walked back through the restaurant into the cold Prague afternoon. And the moment the door closed behind them, the city noise came back. Trams, voices, the ordinary texture of a world that had continued happening while everything inside that room was being decided. And Vincenzo stood on the cobblestones and breathed. His hands were steady. He noticed that. He'd expected them not to be. Eliana was looking at her phone. Then she looked up at the sky, briefly, the way people look at the sky when they are checking something that has nothing to do with weather. "The server access will take Marek's people approximately 4 hours," she said. "The federal channel moves on it tonight. By morning, everything Sal built in Europe has a legal instrument against it. And Sal himself. He's in Philadelphia," she said. "My American contacts are better positioned than you might expect." A pause. "He will be handled." "I want to be there," Vincenzo said. She looked at him. "No. He was my consigliere." "Yes," she said, "and if you're in the room when it happens, you're in the documentation, which means you're in the legal instrument, which means instead of being the person who helped dismantle this, you're a subject of the investigation." She held his gaze. "You do not want to be a subject of this investigation." He looked at her for a long moment. The cold came off the street in waves, the kind that found the gaps in your coat and worked through them. He thought about Sal, not the abstract threat, not the architect of the conspiracy, but the specific man. The folder always face down on the table. The voice stripped of uncertainty. 11 years of standing 3 feet to his left. "All right," he said. She nodded. She put her phone in her pocket, and for a moment, just a moment, neither of them was in operational mode. They were just two people standing on a cobblestone street in Prague in February, in the cold, in the aftermath of something that wasn't finished yet, but had passed its most dangerous point. "Come," she said. And she walked, and he followed, and the city absorbed them both. All right. Sal Benedetti was arrested at his home in Philadelphia at 6:47 the following morning. Vincenzo learned this from Torres, who called it 7:15 Chicago time, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has just watched something he understood was inevitable but had not fully believed in until the moment it happened. The arrest was federal, 3 agencies, a warrant with 47 pages of supporting documentation, charges that ranged from conspiracy to racketeering to 2 counts of ordering violent acts resulting in death, specifically the Vienna operation. The arraignment was closed. The legal instrument moved with the speed of something that had been built over time and was now simply being released, the way water released from a dam moves not with effort, but with the accumulated weight of everything that had been held behind it. Torres said that 3 of Sal's captains had been brought in within the hour, that the Benedetti family's financial accounts, the legitimate ones, the restaurant holdings, the real estate portfolio that Sal had spent 30 years building as a parallel structure, were frozen by end of business the same day. Vincenzo listened to all of it from a chair in the estate on the hill in Prague, which Eliana had returned to the previous evening with the quiet efficiency of someone returning to a workspace after a necessary interruption. He had been given a room. He had slept in it, actually slept, 5 hours without waking, which he didn't expect and which told him something about the specific nature of exhaustion, that it doesn't release you until it decides to. When Torres was done, Vincenzo said, "The organization." "Intact," Torres said. "Shaken. The captains who were Sal's, they're managing. The ones who weren't are managing better." A pause. "There are questions about your position, about what happens next." "Tell them I'm coming back in a week," Vincenzo said. "Tell them nothing happens until I'm back." "And what does happen when you're back?" Vincenzo looked at the window. Prague in the morning, the frost on the glass thinning as the light came up, the rooftops going from dark to gray to something approaching color. "Things change," he said. "Tell them that." He ended the call. The next 4 days in Prague had a quality he didn't have a word for. Suspended, but not uncomfortably. The operational urgency had passed. What remained was the strange, specific experience of existing in someone else's world and understanding it for the first time as a world, not as a backdrop. Eliana worked. She worked with the focused consistency of someone for whom work was not a performance of productivity, but a genuine ongoing engagement with problems that required her specific kind of attention. He watched her manage the restructuring of 3 financial channels that Sal's network had compromised, navigate a series of conversations with European contacts that required her to be simultaneously firm and careful, arrange the documentation of the Continental Shadow Alliance's formal recognition of its new principle, herself, openly, without the concealment that had defined the last decade, in a way that sent a signal through every network that needed to receive it. He watched all of this and said very little, and learned more in 4 days than he had learned in 15 years of running his own operation, which was not a comfortable thing to understand about himself. On the 3rd day, she asked him to sit in on a meeting. It was with 2 men and a woman who arrived separately and who represented, he understood from context, the 3 most significant independent networks in Central Europe. People his organization had peripheral relationships with. People who, in the architecture of the underworld as he'd understood it, existed at a level above his usual reach. They sat around the estate's main table and Eliana led the meeting with the unhurried authority of someone who had been doing this long enough that the authority was simply a fact of the room, not something she needed to establish. She outlined the disruption that Benedetti's operation had caused, what had been resolved, and what the new equilibrium looked like. She was specific. She was honest about the vulnerabilities that the last week had exposed. She did not perform confidence she didn't have. At one point, one of the men, older, Viennese, with the kind of face that had been watching other people's faces for 50 years and had developed a profound ability to read them, looked at Vincenzo and said, "And Mr. Moretti's position in this new arrangement?" Eliana glanced at Vincenzo, just briefly, giving him the floor. He thought about what to say for exactly 2 seconds, and then he said, "That's being determined. I'm here to learn something, not to negotiate terms." The Viennese man looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the specific quality of someone registering that an answer was unexpected and crediting it accordingly. The meeting concluded. The 3 visitors left. Eliana poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of him and sat down across the table from where she'd been sitting during the meeting. She looked tired in a way she allowed herself to look only when there was no one else in the room. A tiredness that was not defeat, but was simply the honest weight of the last week sitting in her face. "That was the right thing to say," she said. "I know," he said. And then, because honesty seemed to be the only currency that had any value left between them, he said, "I didn't know it was the right thing when I said it. I just said the true thing." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but existed in the same neighborhood. "That's usually how the right thing gets said." He turned the water glass in his hands. "What happens now, to us?" The question sat in the room. She didn't answer immediately, which meant she was not going to give him an easy version. "I don't know," she said. "That's the honest answer." "Okay." "I spent 10 years building a version of my life that I wanted to be real," she said. "It wasn't. That's not entirely your fault, and it's not entirely mine. But it happened, and I can't I can't just recalibrate that. I'm not built for that kind of recalibration quickly. I'm not asking quickly, he said. She looked at him. I'm asking what the door looks like, he said. Not whether we're walking through it tomorrow, just whether it exists. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a tram went past somewhere below the hill, its sound rising and fading in the cold air. The light through the window had gone from morning gray to something warmer, the kind of midday light that made old stone look golden rather than heavy. It exists, she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't diminish what she'd just said by adding to it. He'd learned something in the last week about when to stop talking. It was possibly the most expensive lesson he'd ever learned, in the most comprehensive sense of the word expensive. He drank his water and let the room be quiet, and let that be enough. He flew back to Chicago 6 days after he'd arrived in Prague. The city received him the way cities receive returning people, indifferently, with its own weather and its own ongoing concerns. February had deepened while he was gone, the lake gray and brutal, the wind off the water, the particular kind that made Chicago feel like a punishment rather than a place. He stood at the window of the Lakeshore Drive apartment that first evening and looked at it, and thought that he had never, in 15 years of living in this city, actually looked at it, had moved through it purposefully, had used it, had built something inside it, but had not looked at it the way you look at something you might one day not have. He called a meeting of his full captains for the following morning. There were 11 of them. They filed into the conference room at the office on Michigan Avenue with the specific quality of men who had been operating in uncertainty and were ready to be told what the shape of things was going to be. Some of them had been with him for a decade. Some were newer. All of them had heard versions of the last 2 weeks from various angles and had been waiting to hear his version. He stood at the head of the table and looked at them. Sal Benedetti was a traitor, he said. He spent 11 years building a position inside this organization that was designed to hollow it out from the center and hand it to people who none of us would have chosen. He is in federal custody, and he will remain there. He paused. That happened because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. That's on me. The room was very still. Going forward, he said, this organization operates differently. Not smaller, not weaker, differently. He looked at the faces around the table. The financial architecture gets rebuilt from the bottom up. No single person holds the access that Sal held. Every significant decision gets reviewed by at least 2 people whose loyalty to each other is independent of their loyalty to me. He paused again. The violence that we've used as a management tool, that gets pulled back. Way back. The operations that carry that kind of exposure are the ones that made us vulnerable to exactly what Sal was able to do. That stops. One of the older captains, a man named DeLuca, who had been with him for 12 years and who had earned the right to speak, said, "You're talking about restructuring the whole operating model." "Yes," Vincenzo said. "That's not a week's work." "No," he agreed. "It's not." DeLuca looked at him. "Who's behind this? The woman in Prague?" Vincenzo held DeLuca's gaze steadily. "I'm behind this," he said. "The woman in Prague showed me what an organization looks like when it's built to last instead of built to dominate. The difference is significant, and I should have understood it earlier." He looked around the table. "Anyone who can't operate in the direction I'm describing should say so now. There's no penalty for honesty. The penalty is for what comes after the decision is made." Nobody spoke. He nodded. "Then we start." Sal's trial began 8 weeks later. It ran for 11 days and produced a verdict that sent him to a federal facility in Pennsylvania for the remainder of a life that had, by that point, already been comprehensively dismantled. The Benedetti family's operations in New York and Philadelphia collapsed without him. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in the gradual, inevitable way that structures collapse when the central load-bearing element is removed. The captains scattered, the alliances dissolved. The legitimate portfolio was seized. It was not a satisfying end, in the way that endings in stories are satisfying. It was a legal proceeding. It had the texture of legal proceedings. Procedural, documented, stripped of the drama that the events warranted. Vincenzo watched it through reports and updates, and did not attend and felt nothing he would have predicted when he thought, in the weeks before, about what the conclusion of it would feel like. What he felt was tired, and something underneath the tired that might, given enough time, become something else. 3 months after Prague, he received a letter, not an email. A physical letter, on paper, in an envelope postmarked from the Czech Republic, his name written in the handwriting he had seen on 10 years' worth of notes, left on kitchen counters and appointment cards, and one birthday card that he had kept in his desk drawer without being entirely sure why. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the restructuring of the Continental Shadow Alliance's formal leadership structure, which was now public within the relevant networks. Eliana Volkov as principal, with a council of 7 representatives from the alliance's major constituent organizations, operating under a charter that Viktor Volkov had apparently drafted in the last year of his life, and that his daughter had spent 4 years quietly maneuvering into place. The second paragraph described a conversation she'd had with the Viennese man from the meeting Vincenzo had attended. A conversation in which the man had mentioned, apparently with some care, that the Moretti organization's restructuring had been observed by several major networks and was being regarded as significant. That the model Vincenzo was building was the kind of model that opened certain doors that had previously been closed to American syndicate operations. The third paragraph was 4 sentences. I'm coming to Chicago in April. Not for any operational reason. I don't know what that means yet, or what it should mean. But I thought you should know. He read it twice at his desk in the Michigan Avenue office, the city visible through the windows behind him, still gray, still cold, but the specific cold of late February giving way to something marginally less hostile, the lake a shade lighter than it had been, the kind of change you could only perceive if you'd been watching long enough. He set the letter on the desk and looked at it. Then he opened his desk drawer and put it beside the birthday card and closed the drawer and went back to work. April came the way April comes to Chicago, reluctantly, with several false starts and one late snow that covered the city for 2 days in something that looked like forgiveness and then melted into the same cold gray it had always been. But underneath the gray, things were turning, the trees along the lakefront coming back, the water changing color, the light staying longer each evening in a way that accumulated over days into something you could actually feel. She arrived on a Tuesday. He knew she was in the city before she told him, because he had people and because the kind of arrival she made, quiet, no announcement, a car from the airport to a hotel he hadn't booked for her, was the kind of arrival that registered in the peripheral awareness of anyone paying the right kind of attention. He paid the right kind of attention, and he waited, and he did not reach out. She called him at noon. "I'm at the hotel," she said. "I know," he said. A pause. "Of course you do. Are you hungry?" Another pause, shorter. "Yes?" He took her to a restaurant he'd been eating at for 12 years, in the neighborhood near the river, the kind of place that had never been fashionable, and therefore had never had to reinvent itself. The same menu for 2 decades, the same owner behind the same bar, the kind of dark wood and low light that made it feel like a room outside of time. He'd had 1,000 meals there with people who mattered to his organization. He'd never taken Eliana there. She looked at it when they walked in with an expression that he read. He was reading her better now, with the practice of someone who has finally started paying attention, as approval. Not of the restaurant specifically, of the choice to bring her somewhere real. They sat at a corner table and ordered, and the food came and they ate. And for the first 3 minutes, they talked about practical things. The restructuring, the Alliance's new charter, a minor complication in the Rotterdam corridor that had been resolved last week. Professional things. Comfortable things. In the specific way that professional topics are comfortable between people who have a lot of other things they could be talking about but aren't yet. Then she set her fork down and looked at him. "You look different," she said. "Tired," he said. "No," she said. "Tired is what you looked like before. This is something else." She considered it. "You look like someone who has stopped waiting for something." He thought about that. "Maybe I stopped waiting for things to go back to the way they were." "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She picked her fork back up. The restaurant moved around them with its ordinary evening life. Other tables, other conversations, the clatter from the kitchen, The specific warmth of a room where the same people have been feeding other people for a long time and have gotten good at the steady comfort of it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "The night of the syndicate gathering," he said. "What I said. How I said it." He kept his eyes on her because looking away from this would be a kind of cowardice he was done permitting himself. "I've thought about it every day since Prague, not because of what it cost, because of what it was." He paused. "It was cruel, specifically, deliberately cruel, in a room full of people, directed at someone who had given me no cause for it, except existing in a way that made me feel like I needed an audience's confirmation that I was still the most important person present." He stopped. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm telling you that I know what it was." The restaurant was warm around them. Somewhere a glass clinked, the sound of other people's ordinary evenings going on. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone assembling a response, the silence of someone actually receiving what had been said, which was different, rarer. "I know you know," she said finally. "That's the only reason I'm here." He nodded. I don't have a plan for this," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I spent 10 years having a plan for everything, including the plan for leaving, including the plan for what happened after. I don't have a plan for this conversation or the ones after it." "Neither do I," he said. "That should worry me more than it does," she said. Something happened in his chest. Not a dramatic thing, nothing that would have been visible from across the table. Just a quiet shift, like a room when someone opens a window and the air changes without the temperature changing. Something altered at a level below what you could point to. "There's a council meeting in May," she said. "The Full Alliance Council, formal session. Prague, probably, or possibly Vienna." She looked at him. "The Moretti organization's restructuring has generated enough interest that there may be a conversation about a formal association. Not absorption, not subordination. Association. On what terms? Terms that would require you to maintain the changes you've already made and formalize them in a charter." She held his gaze. "And terms that would require you to operate under a transparency agreement with the Alliance's compliance structure." He turned his water glass in his hands. "You'd be auditing me." "The council would," she said. "Not me personally." "Same thing." "Is it a problem?" He looked at her across the restaurant table, in the warm light of a place that had been feeding people through every variety of difficulty for 20 years, and he thought about what his answer to that question would have been a year ago, 6 months ago, even 3 months ago. The reflexive rejection of any structure that positioned itself above his own authority, the instinctive protection of sovereignty that had been the organizing principle of his professional life. He thought about what that sovereignty had actually built. "No," he said, "it's not a problem." She nodded. She picked up her wine glass and he picked up his, and they didn't make a toast because neither of them was the kind of person who made toasts, but they drank, and the evening continued, and outside the restaurant the Chicago Spring was doing what Chicago Springs did, arriving unevenly, arguing with itself, cold 1 hour and almost warm the next, the lake changing color by degrees towards something that was not quite yet what it was going to become. The Alliance's annual formal gathering that autumn was held in Vienna. It was nothing like the Blackthorn Grand. No chandeliers, no theater of power arranged in 800 crystal drops. The venue was a private estate outside the city, and the gathering had the quality of something functional. People who knew each other well enough not to need the performance, who were there to do the work of maintaining what they'd built, in all its complications, and its ongoing fragility and its occasional surprising resilience. Eliana arrived early, the way she always arrived early, and stood near the window of the main hall watching the others come in. She had done this since she was a child, at gatherings far smaller than this one. Stood near the window, watched the room fill, mapped it before it was complete. She heard him before she saw him. The way a room changes when Vincenzo Moretti walks into it had not changed. That quality of recalibrated attention, the slight adjustment that even rooms full of serious people made in his direction. What had changed was the direction of his gaze when he came in. He came in and he found her immediately. Not because she was the most significant person in the room, not because she was the most powerful person in the room, though she was both of those things. He found her because she was the person he was looking for. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. "How was the drive from the airport?" she said. "Truck," he said. "What?" "There was a truck blocking the—" "It doesn't matter." He looked out the window at the estate's grounds, the October light coming low and golden across the grass. "The council meeting starts at 9? 8:30, she said. "I thought 9. I sent a message yesterday updating the schedule." "I didn't see it. You have to actually read the—" I know. She looked at him with the expression that had replaced, over the months of this year, the careful neutral expression she had worn for 10 years in Chicago. Less managed, less constructed, the expression of someone who has stopped performing how they feel and is simply, imperfectly, feeling it. "You're going to be late," she said. "I'm standing next to you," he said. "I'm exactly where I should be." She turned back to the window. The room was filling behind them, the voices of 40 people who were doing the complicated, imperfect, ongoing work of maintaining something that was worth maintaining, rising and mixing and creating the particular sound of a gathering that is not performing power but is simply exercising it, quietly, in the service of something that might last. Outside, the October light moved across the grass, and the trees at the edge of the property held their color. Still gold, not yet gone, in the particular suspension of autumn that exists between what things were and what they are about to become. Neither of them moved from the window. Neither of them needed to. The morning was beginning, and the work was real. And they were, for the first time in 10 years and in all the ways that mattered, exactly where they had chosen to be.